Mobile app buttons are usually boring. If you still use touchable opacity everywhere, you should think about yourself. What if the buttons were actually fun to tap? Let's make them smooth, interactive, and impossible to ignore.
Let's do it.
Let's start with something easy, changing the background, but with a smooth transition. Because this is lame, but this is beautiful. First, all these buttons use my basic button from the last video. If you missed it, I won't judge, but you should probably check it out. There is a link in the description. And you probably shouldn't skip the upcoming part, because all the other buttons will be based on the following code, and you may wonder what the hell the code is doing. We are not going to use the pressed variable, so we can get rid of it. Of course, we are going to use reanimated. Instead of a regular view, we are going to use animated view. Why? Because it sounds cooler, obviously. We are going to use shared value hook from reanimated. We are going to use it to store the transition progress value on the UI thread, because laggy animations are a crime.
It's illegal.
It will change from 0 non-active to 1 active. To make the animation smooth, we are going to use with timing function from reanimated. Let's say we want the transition to take
300
milliseconds. When the user starts pressing the button, the transition changes from 0 to 1 in
300
milliseconds. And when they release the button, the transition value changes back to 0 in
300
milliseconds. Now we need to use the used animated style hook. Based on the transition value, we are going to change the background color. But to do it, we need the interpolate color function from reanimated. The first argument takes the transition value, the second is the range of values we care about, and the third says which colors we want to use. The function automatically calculates the intermediate colors between the specified range, and the result is a beautiful transition from one color to another. You could also add more values between the 0 and 1 and add more colors. Now, can you see what can be improved? We want the button to always fully animate from one color to another, no matter how quickly the user taps it. Because I can barely see I really touched it, and that makes me nervous. We need another shared value to indicate whether the button is being pressed or not. We are going to change its value accordingly. We want the transition to change back to 0 only if the button is released and the animation has finished. But now, the transition doesn't change back when the user taps the button quickly. We need another shared value. I'm kidding. We need to add a callback to the first with timing function, which will change the transition value back to 0 once the animation finishes, if the button is no longer active. And that's it. Okay, this was boring. Let's do something more funny. Do you like resizing buttons?
Yes!
I do. It's simple but satisfying. We are going to do exactly the same as with the previous button, but instead of interpolating colors, we are going to interpolate the scale. We are going to scale the button down by 5%. Easy. Next! Everyone loves buttons with shadows, but nobody's animating them.
Boring!
We will. First, let's say we want to use an elevation of value 16. On Android, it's easy. But iOS needs to be special again. We are going to use semi-transparent black shadow. We are going to calculate a shadow offset and shadow radius which correspond to the Android elevation. In the new versions of React Native, it's also possible to use the box shadow style. But I couldn't make it work on the web, and it's also not supported by Reanimated yet. This is something similar to what Duolingo uses, but better. Because, again, there is the transition. We need to wrap the animated view in another React Native view and add another view before the animated view. Let's move the border radius and the height to a constant because we will use it in multiple places. Now add styles for the shadow view. It's going to have the same height and border radius as the container, but a darker color. And that's it. I'm kidding. We need to set the container's position to absolute and set its width explicitly to 100%. Now we need to define the shadow height and move the shadow by this value. And finally, we can animate the container's top position like this. Static icons are boring. Let's move it.
I like to move it. I like to move it.
First, we are going to animate the text. So we are going to use animated text instead of text. We are going to make the button disappear when the button is pressed. We need another animated style for the icon container. Wait, icon container? Yeah, this one. Now we can move the icon when the button is pressed. Let's move it by 100 points. Okay, that's probably too much. How to center the icon on press? We need to retrieve the container's width and icon's position on the x-axis. We can get both from the onLayout callback. Now we can calculate how much we need to move the icon to get to the center. One last thing, the icon doesn't turn around when it's going back. We need another shared value. Then we can check if the current transition value is lower than the previous value. And based on this, we can change the icon's direction. I don't know who invented this, but probably the same person who invented these elevators. But it's a bit popular, so let's do it. Let's rename the transition to background transition because there will be two transitions and we don't want to confuse ourselves in the future. Instead of using a single icon and title, we are going to use an array of them and call them steps. Each step is going to have its own container and we are going to leave the background color and the border radius in the outer container. Now we are going to iterate over steps and render their icon and title inside the step container. Because the steps will be scrolling down, we need to reverse the steps array. Now we can remove the redundant icon and title properties. We are going to create a height constant as it will be used in multiple places. Then we can use it to set the container's height and hide everything that overflows the container's height. All the steps are still there, but you can see them because they are being cut off. Now we are going to add an animated view that will handle the scrolling. Because the state will be handled from outside, we need to pass the current step to the component. We can use it to disable the button if the current step is not the initial one. We need another shared value to handle the scroll transition. It's also going to have a duration of 300 milliseconds. And when the current step property changes, it will also change the scroll transition value. We can cancel the animation on unmount. The last missing piece is to move the selected step to the visible area. The first step is here, the second step is somewhere here, and the third step is somewhere here, and they will be scrolling down. Now, some attention seeker buttons. This can be either a button that looks so good you just want to touch it.
What a beautiful button, but no touching.
Or a button that is trying to force you to press it.
You're not going to push the button.
But I am going to push the button. Why wouldn't I?
Because you don't want to be a slave.
Gradients are beautiful, but you know what's more beautiful? You. No, moving gradients. Let's move the height to a constant because we will need it in multiple places. We are going to wrap the content in another view. Let's call it outer container. We need to retrieve the outer container's width because we will use it later. We are going to use the onLayout callback for it. For the gradient, we are going to use Expo Linear Gradient package. We are going to render the linear gradient and set its colors to purple and indigo. We need to set its height and pass the style to it. We want a horizontal gradient, not vertical. We can do it like this. Now we are going to move the content on top of the gradient and make the container's background color transparent if it's not being pressed. We are going to set the gradient's width to the outer container's width multiplied by 3 and use the same colors once again to make the color transition smooth. Don't ask me why, it's just pure magic. We will be moving the gradient background from left to right. It will start in this state, then it will move like this and like this. That simple it is. It took me like 5 minutes to invent this. We are going to run a sequence that will change the transition value to 1 in 2 seconds and then immediately back to 0. This doesn't make sense, I know. That's when it reaches the end, and we are going to repeat it infinitely. Don't forget to cancel the animation when it's being unmounted. Now, we are going to handle the movement. Let's import use animated style and use derived value hooks. We are going to interpolate the transition value and change the translate x value accordingly, and pass the style to the animated view. We are going to style the outer container to hide the magic. And that's it. A button with water waves, or sound waves, or whatever waves, begging to be tapped. We are going to have two transitions, so let's rename the common one to background transition. Let's move the border radius and the height to constants because we will need them in multiple places. We are going to define some configuration first. We want two animated pulses. We want it to take 2 seconds.
That's what she said.
And we want some delay between the pulses. We are going to create a separate component for the pulses to avoid repetition. The component is going to return animated view. Let's add some styles and pass them to the view. Now we can create an empty array with the length of the number of pulses, iterate over it and render each pulse. Each pulse is going to have its own transition. Again, we are going to change its value in sequence. First, we are going to change it to 1 in the specified 2 seconds. Then, change it back to 0 immediately. We are going to use easing out, easing ease to make it look like waves. But the duration is wrong. We want the first pulse to take longer than the second one. We want the second pulse to chase the first one, and we want them to finish together.
That's what she said.
Like the waves. So we need to increase the duration by the delay, but it's still not enough. We need to make the duration dynamic depending on the index. This way, the first pulse is going to have a duration of 2700 milliseconds and the second one 2000 milliseconds. If there were 3 pulses, it would be 3400, 2700 and 2000. Easy. But we also need to add some delay so the pulses don't start at the same time. Again, it's going to be dynamic. First pulse is going to have a delay of 0 milliseconds, the second 700 milliseconds, and the third, if there is one, 1400 milliseconds. We are also going to repeat it infinitely. Don't forget to clean up after yourself. Now we can add some animated styles. We are going to animate the opacity and also the scale. But we don't want the animation to run if the button is disabled or in a loading state. And we also want the animation to stop if the button becomes disabled or its state changes to loading. The last thing we need to do is to move the pulses to the background. A button with a heartbeat. This animation would drive me crazy and probably made me press it no matter what it does. Let's say we want a 3-second delay between the bounces and each movement to take, you can guess, 300 milliseconds. We need another shared value for the bounce transition. We are going to run a sequence when we are going to change the value to 1, then to 0, then to 1 and then to 0 again to bounce twice quickly each run. And we are going to add the delay and run it infinitely and cancel the animation on unmount. We also don't want the animation to run if the button is disabled or in a loading state. Now we can interpolate the transition value and scale the button by 10%. Another annoying button. Let's say we want our rotation transition to take 3 seconds and take 300 milliseconds. Again, we need another shared value, and we are going to run a sequence which will change the transition value to 1 and then back to 0. We are going to add a delay between each run and run it infinitely and cancel the animation on unmount. Then we can interpolate the transition value and rotate the button accordingly. When the transition value is 0, the rotation degree is going to be 0. When the value is 0.5, the degree is going to be -5. When the value is 1, the degree is going to be 5. And we are going to disable the animation if the button is disabled or in a loading state. Do you think all the previous buttons suck and want something more? Check out react-native-store.com. How is the performance? Of course it's running at 60 FPS. If this is not running at 60 FPS, I will delete my GitHub account. I can keep it. Or maybe I just cut the video. Who knows? Of course, it's fast. I'm not here to teach you how to write laggy animations. What about dark mode? Everything works, but shadows in dark mode are a bit weird. And does it work on Android and the web too? Sure. Who do you think I am? Yes, you could use a multi-library and make this all a bit simpler. If you prefer declarative programming or you are lazy to write more code, definitely go check it out. But before you use it, maybe you should understand what it does under the hood. In this tutorial, we've been using Reanimated version 3. In version 4, many things are much easier, but I like it tough.
Really? Nothing.
If you just want to copy-paste the previous buttons, there is a link to the GitHub repository in the description, and there is also a link to the Expo snack. You want your app to be fun to use, right? A lot of apps just use touchable opacity and that's it. Stand out from this boredom. A little animation can make your app unforgettable and keep your users coming back. What interesting button animation did I miss? Let me know in the comments and maybe I will make a video about it, or maybe not. Want to see another cool button? Check out the subscribe button below. It has a fun little animation when you press it. Give it a try. Peace.